Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. We have been talking about how to present the case for Christianity, how to present the gospel to your friends and family members using the unique skill set, the tools that the prosecutors and attorneys learn while they're presenting a case in front of a jury. Look, we've talked over the past several weeks about how to develop a more evidential, a more reasonable Christian faith, and all this material comes from my book, Forensic Faith. The idea here is that we could move from a blind or an unreasonable faith, which we maybe have held for a lot of our Christian life, and we could move toward a more reasonable faith that could be expressed in the public square, one that could actually communicate the truth effectively to the world around us. Now look, in order to do that, we're going to have to embrace some principles that first responders kind of take for granted. And that is, number one, we're going to have to understand what our duty is to begin with. We've already talked about that. We're going to have to understand how to train to get ready to do. We've already talked about training. We're going to have to understand how to investigate truth claims. We've talked about that. And we're in this final section where we're talking about how to communicate what you have learned to the world around you, to your own personal jury of friends and family members. And now, a lot of this is available still on our YouTube channel. You can go there. You can find the link to the YouTube channel at coldcasechristianity.com. There's also a section there of all the videos. You can watch them there. So get caught up if you haven't been keeping pace with us. Of course, if you're DVRing this at the NRB network, you will be able to watch all those. And they replay some of these also going forward, so keep your eyes open for those as well. Now, today what we're going to talk about is the last step in communicating the gospel, or communicating what you learned about Christianity to the world around you. And that is how to make a closing argument persuasively. How to make a closing argument persuasively. And what I don't mean when I say make a closing argument is to be argumentative. Look, what I'm trying to do is glean some principles from jury trials that'll help you to be a better, more effective Christian communicator. And we've talked about how to select a jury, how to inform that jury and instruct that jury on the rules of evidence. We've talked about how to make an opening statement and how to present evidence. And now we're talking about how to close, how to basically finish your description of Christianity, your presentation of the gospel. There are some things we can learn from the role that is played by prosecutors and defense attorneys in criminal trials, but more importantly, there is a lesson to be learned from watching the master do it on the pages of Scripture, because Jesus knew how to do all of these things, and he certainly was a great opener. We've talked about that in a prior episode, and today I want to show you how great a closer he was. And let's take a look at this from the Gospel of Matthew. So let's go ahead and go to our verse here in Matthew chapter 7. This is at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most impressive, if not the most impressive lecture, moral teaching ever given in the history of humankind. And here he is closing. He says, therefore, after saying all that he said in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, yet it did not fall. For it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Now, just leave this verse up here for a minute. I want you to see it and take a look at how powerful this closing is. It begins with the therefore, right? So in other words, he's presented some premises that he wants you to act on. He's now going to conclude, based on everything I've told you before, therefore. So the therefore tells us that he's turning a corner toward a closing. And then he'll say that he wants to emphasize the importance of what he's already said, and he wants his hearers to act. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. Now, that's a really, I think, amazing example of how you can close powerfully by reminding your audience of what's been said and by encouraging them to act now on what has been said. Now, that being the case, I want to give you a few tips that you can use that are based on some of the principles we use in jury trials. And basically, here's the first one. First presentation tip when you're closing is to be confident, to close confidently. I think you recognize, we've talked about this before, that confidence ends up displaying itself in a certain kind of character. When you're confident about your position, you do not fall into this fight or flight syndrome when you're not confident, right? If you aren't sure you can defend yourself in a fight, you're going to say a lot of things in an effort to kind of get out of the fight because you don't think you got the muscle it takes to defend yourself in the fight. We talk about this all the time, right? That the noisiest dog in the dog yard is the Chihuahua. The tiny little Chihuahua who is barking like crazy and puffing up and strutting around and snapping at everyone's heels because there's a fear factor going on here. He's the smallest dog in the yard. And he knows he's the smallest dog in the yard, so he's going to make a lot of noise. So you will think he's bigger than he actually is. And we can sound like Christian Chihuahuas if we're not careful. That really comes down to a lack of confidence. If we believe that our case is strong and is the best inference from evidence and is hands down the best inference from evidence, then we ought to be really calm when we're encountering people, for example, on social media. Have you ever seen this? You post something that has some religious content, some Christian content on your social media page, say Facebook, and immediately it's attacked by somebody, and you've got a choice now on how you're going to respond. Are you going to respond with confidence and the calm kind of character that comes from knowing you're in the right, and there's no reason to puff up and act like a Chihuahua? Great Danes don't make any noise in the yard. The biggest dog, the most confident dog, just knows that he doesn't need to make a lot of noise. And that's what we are in the worldview of all the different potential worldviews. In the dog yard of worldviews, Christianity is the Great Dane. Why would we then act like the Chihuahua? So when we present a closing argument in front of a jury, we are always calm, hope to have good character in front of that jury because we know we have the truth. We often say it this way, that it's easier for us than it is for the defense because we happen to have the truth, so we don't have to push so hard to try to convince people. We simply have to kind of just slowly unwrap this case in front of the jury, and they will eventually see what the truth is, and we have a really pretty easy job at that point. The only way we can mess it up is if we don't have good demeanor, good character, because we forget to hold on to our confidence and let our confidence be our guide. So close confidently. That's the first principle. Let me give you one more before the break. I want to encourage you to summarize your case visually. Summarize the case visually. Now, this is something that can be a challenge for some of us, but I will tell you, after doing these in front of jury trials, when I first came into working in these kinds of cases, I was a relatively new Christian, but I was already serving in youth ministry. I was already a youth pastor. I was maybe a 5-year Christian, 6-year Christian, and I was serving in youth ministry. And I was presenting the case for Christianity to young people visually because I knew that they were wired this way. This is just on the eve of a kind of smartphone use and all the kind of glowing rectangle at the end of your hand that always has video on it. But I knew that I was a visual person. I had a background in the visual arts. And so I wanted to make a visual case for my jury, which at the time was young people in a youth ministry. Now, you may not feel like you're capable of summarizing something visually. But let me give you a couple of examples. Take a look at this illustration from... this is from Cold Case Christianity, my first book. And in it, I'm showing how I might make a case, how these 7 or 8 things all point, 9 things actually, all point to the identity of the suspect. And the idea here is that when I would put this on the screen in front of a jury, it wouldn't be like hand drawn like this. I might actually use the real pictures of the real evidence so they could see how everything points back to the suspect we have sitting at the end of the table. And I think this makes it very powerful. They can see the collection of evidences. They can see how he is at the center of all of it. We've made it visual. Now, you may not feel like you can do such an illustration or have the means by which, you're talking to someone at a restaurant, and how am I going to make this visual? Well, do you have a napkin? It turns out that even the simplest stick figure diagram can be incredibly effective when making the case. Let me show you now the same kind of illustration with the same suspect and the same pieces of evidence as you might sketch it out on a napkin. This illustration is from Forensic Faith, just trying to show that you could, given whatever skill set you happen to have, make an illustration. And it could be something very simple. But the point is, they'll see how all and by the way, then you can use this diagram to draw more and show how things are interconnected and why this is the most reasonable inference from evidence. But the point is, I'm making this visual, and I do think, and I can tell you, having done this in front of juries, that when you brief the jury afterwards, when you actually ask them questions about how you presented the case, most will point back to the visual nature of the case, and they'll say, yeah, I could see it. They'll use language that reveals the fact that the visual presentation was powerful. They'll say things like, yeah, it was so clear to me. I could see it. I don't know why no one saw it earlier. Well, they're saying that because they could see this on the screen. As a matter of fact, sometimes we would put images on the screen that they would then recall to us as if they had been at the crime scene because they had seen so much of the crime scene because we presented it visually. Try your best to sketch out the case. Let me show you a couple of other examples of how you might sketch out a case. Now, granted, these are more robust illustrations from on my books, but again, you could use the same approach to drawing it on a napkin. Here, for example, is the case for Peter's influence on the Gospel of Mark. All of these pieces of evidence I talk about in Cold Case Christianity, but as I draw them, you can see that, look, Mark mentions, has a certain familiarity with Simon Peter that's unusual compared to the other Gospels. Peter starts the story of Mark. He finishes at the end of the book of Mark. Mark's Gospel, it mentions Peter more frequently than other Gospels. Not only that, you've got church fathers who have named Peter as the source. Papias, for example, of Mark's Gospel. All the embarrassing elements of Peter's story have been omitted. His knowledge has been included. And finally, the outline that Peter uses in Acts when he does the sermon at Pentecost is the rough outline of the book of Gospel of Mark. Now look, I could say all those things, but when you see this illustration, isn't it clear? This is why we use illustrations, to make more robust claims clearer, wordier claims, visually concise. Let me show you one more. The case in God's crime scene, when I'm trying to explain why a good and all-powerful God would allow evil to occur at all. Well, I think there are a number of reasons that have to be considered together to explain any particular act of evil. And I could list those, but when I kind of draw them out, and here's an illustration that I use in God's crime scene, I think it does come down to these 7 things. These are the reasons why God would allow any act of evil, including any crime that I might investigate later as a homicide detective. So I think that these kinds of diagrams are incredibly helpful because what they do is they allow you to make a more complex set of words concise and visual. So I want you to consider the idea that you could even sketch these out quickly, create your own diagrams, create your own ideas for diagrams, and you can do those on napkins. Give it a try. You won't be sorry you did. Let's take a break, and when I come back, I'll give you some more presentation tips for how to make a persuasive closing argument.
Be sure to download the free Cold Case Christianity app from the iTunes Store and the Android Marketplace. The Cold Case Christianity app puts all the resources from coldcasechristianity.com in the palm of your hand. You can read the daily blog, listen to podcasts, and watch videos from within the application. And Jim uses the app to send direct messages to fans of Cold Case Christianity. The app will also link you to all the Cold Case Christianity social media and provide you with a direct connection to J. Warner Wallace. Download the app today and become a better Christian case maker. Jay Warner and Susie Wallace have written 3 kids' books to help children know the truth and defend it in the public square. All 3 books mirror Jay Warner's adult books, chapter by chapter. And best yet, the kids' books are written as fictional stories that will turn your kids into detectives as they solve mysteries and learn about Christianity. There's also an interactive academy website at casemakersacademy.com where your kids can join other cadets and complete their own academy notebook. Each course has free videos, activity sheets, and more. Your young readers can even earn their own Junior Detective graduation certificates and appear on the Honor Cadet Wall. Be sure to visit casemakersacademy.com to learn more.
Okay, let's continue with a few tips for how to make a persuasive closing argument. And again, we're not trying to be argumentative, and we're not trying to be so structured, right? So structured that I'm saying you've got to take it in this order. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying you have to do this opening a certain way, you have to present a certain way. I'm just saying as you think about presenting the gospel to your friends, you will start to include some of these ideas. And maybe not formally, but I hope you'll think about these in the back of your head when you've got a chance. For example, when you're sitting at that restaurant and that napkin's sitting right next to you, you can pull out your pen and actually draw something. Here's my point. These are tips. They're not to be used rigidly. They're not to dictate how you present what you're going to present. I just hope they'll make you a better presenter. Now let's talk about tip number 3. And that is you've got to offer a rebuttal at some point. And do it with gentleness. This is what 1 Peter 3 tells us to do, right? To offer a rebuttal, to offer a reason for the hope we have in Jesus with gentleness and respect. But what do I mean by rebuttal? Well, in every jury trial, we have the opening statement. We're not allowed to argue in the opening statement. That's why it's called a statement and not an opening argument. Then we present all the evidence we've told them we're going to present in the opening statement. Then we, at the end, connect the dots for people. We connect the dots. And that's what you're trying to do here, is to help people connect the dots as you summarize everything you've already explained to them. Now, at the end of that, they're more than likely going to have some kind of response. It may be positive, it may be negative. And if it is negative, if they come back and say, yeah, but, and they offer some but, well, then you're going to want to respond to the but with a rebuttal. And that's what we're going to do here. We always get a chance, by the way. We do a closing argument on the prosecution side. Then the defense team does a closing argument. And we are the only ones who are then allowed to offer a rebuttal. And we get that opportunity because the burden of proof in criminal trials is on us. We have the higher burden of proof. So we want to make sure we respond to whatever the rebuttal, whatever they will say in their closing argument. So that's what we call our rebuttal. Now, you're going to get a chance to do this too, because you have to be equipped to be able to answer questions. And you can see how you might raise an issue that somebody would ask a reasonable question. Well, wait a minute, if that's true, then what about this? And you're going to want to then respond, and respond with gentleness. Respond. Now, look, a lot of us as Christians have kind of been raised up in a culture where we think that we're really careful not to be disagreeable, right? And it's one thing to offer the gospel. Then when someone says, well, yeah, but don't push that on me, we kind of think, didn't Jesus tell us that we should not be judgmental and we shouldn't be too aggressive in our approach? And I think there's a verse in Scripture that gets widely misunderstood. And I'm going to show it to you. It's right here in Matthew 7, right? So we're in the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus says this, do not judge so that you will not be judged. And in a sense, I think a lot of us are afraid, because of this verse, to even judge ideas, to even judge the position of people who are maybe atheists or don't believe what we believe as Christians. And we're almost afraid to kind of push against that. Are we judging them as incorrect, as wrong, and then does that make us judgmental? Not if you read the entire verse. So I want to make sure we always follow that principle, right, of never read a verse out of context. And so let's go back to that verse in Matthew 7 and take a longer look at it, okay? So here we are in Matthew 7, again, starting in Matthew 7:1, but we're going to go a lot further. Do not judge, so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it'll be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that's in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So if you look at this verse in its totality, you can see that there's a certain kind of judgment that is being described here. It is the hypocritical judgment. In fact, this verse calls us to judge. But first, take the log out of your own eye. If you've got some issue in your own life and you're trying to to help somebody else remove that issue from their life, then think about how effective you can be if you have a bigger problem than they do and you're trying to talk to them about it. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then, so again, this is a call to judgment. This is a call that is calling you to make a judgment. Then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So I think it's fair for us in a rebuttal situation where we are responding to the objections of those around us, they've offered us. I think it's fair for us to say, okay, look, unless, first of all, admit your failings. Admit your failings. If there's some area that you're going to be accused of something, then admit your failings. And I don't think this verse, for example, I don't even really think applies to us as we're sharing the gospel, because this is really more about making moral judgments with your brother and about saying, hey, don't do this or don't do that, when you in fact are doing worse. But the gospel is a neutral presentation of an historical reality called the resurrection of Jesus. And then we can move from that to the offer of salvation, because if Jesus did rise from the dead, then he's not just a prophet with a good idea about how to be saved. He is God incarnate, showing us the one true way to be saved. So I think we could actually don't be afraid, is what I'm trying to say, to respond, and to actually, if someone pushes, leave a stone in their shoe. Raise the issue in such a way that they will be thinking about it after you're done. Let me go to presentation tip number 4. Ask for a decision, and ask for it passionately. We don't just present facts to a jury. We ask them then to go and make a decision about these facts. Render a verdict. Scary, right? I mean, in some ways you think, okay, that's a big ask, but we have to make that ask, or we've done all this for no reason at all. There are times when it's really easy to make a case as an apologist, to make a case for Christianity based on the historical record or based on the evidence, but forget that the whole reason why we're making a case is so we can present the gospel. Apologetics is not an end of itself. It's the idea we're using this type of case making to remove barriers that make the pathway clear for the gospel. If you forget why we're doing this, you will end up sounding argumentative. You will not sound like you care more about the facts than the soul of the person to whom you're talking. We want to get to the gospel. And that's this little tip of asking for a decision, asking for someone to think about it. Now's the time to make that decision. The gospel is open to all of us right now. If it's true, why would anyone reject it? If life is eternal, why would somebody want to spend eternity separated from God? These are great questions to ask as you turn a corner from presenting the case to asking someone to accept the offer of salvation offered through Jesus Christ. So, again, don't just stop at the presentation of evidence. Make sure that you turn a corner and ask for a decision. Last tip, here it is. You got to place the case in the hands of your jury confidently. You have to do it. And it's hard to do because there's times when you feel like, and I felt this way in jury trials many times. My partner, John Lewin, who was a prosecutor in these cases, we often say, hey, look, we did everything we could do. Now, we did our job. Now they have to do their job. But if they don't do their job, it's not because we didn't do ours. If they don't make a decision that we think is the right decision, it's not because we didn't do everything we were supposed to do. We just want to get to that point of releasing it to a jury where we feel confident that we did everything we could do, knowing full well that even if you do everything you can do, it may not turn out the way you hope. And you had better learn that as well as you're presenting the case to your loved ones. I want to play an analogy here for you. I've talked about it before on this show, I think. And that is that presenting the gospel is not like a game of tennis where you're on one side of the net and your opponent's on the other, and you're doing your best to keep the ball in bounds, to respond to every volley, to do your part to score a point. And if you don't, if it goes out of bounds, it's all on you. Who else can you blame? It's only you versus the other person. That is not what we're doing in the enterprise of sharing the gospel. Instead of a game of tennis, evangelism is really a game of baseball. Let me put the illustration on the wall for you so you can see it. It's a team effort. And I know it is tempting to think that the only way you score in this effort is to hit a home run, to get that person to drop to his knees and say, yes, I repent, I accept what the Lord Jesus has done for me, I accept the offer of salvation, that he died on that cross in my place, and he paid the price for what I deserve, all that, right, that we know is the gospel. It's tempting to think that unless the person you're talking to goes that far, that you have failed as an evangelist, that you have failed as a family member who is just trying to share what you believe as a Christian. That is not the case. That is not the case, because you don't know where your family member is on the base path. Your goal as a Christian should be to get up off the bench and make contact with the ball. That's it. You may get a home run, don't know, but you may just advance a runner. And by the way, if you do advance that runner from first to second, or from second to third, you may never know it, because you're only looking, and you really can tell really if when they come all the way home and accept the offer of salvation, right? That's kind of an obvious point of reference. And you may not know that you've advanced the runner. They might even give you a sign that you have, but in their head and their heart, they know that they're a little closer. You put that stone in their shoe. You cannot walk away from these conversations if you don't get a home run feeling as though you failed. No, you actually didn't fail. You may have advanced the runner and you didn't even know it. And by the way, if somebody does in front of you accept the offer of salvation, don't get too cocky. It may not have been just you hitting a home run. It may have been lots of people advancing that person around the bases, and that guy was sitting there on third base and he was leaning in, ready to come home, and something you said was the last factor, the thing that finally drove him home. It may not have been that much. This is my point, is that all of us, when we are saved, usually most of us will have a story going back to this. I first heard the gospel back when. It's a journey, and for some of us like me, it takes a long time. And you just don't know where your loved ones are. This is another reason why I have hope, even for those loved ones that I have who don't appear to have made any movement at all. My prayer is that they really are on third base. They really are heading home. And in those last moments of their life, in front of, when the only thing they have is their connection with a holy God, they may have come all the way home and I'll never know it until I get home to see them. So have confidence that you just do your job. It's a game of baseball, and your job is to make contact with the ball. Advance runners if you can. You may never even know what you've accomplished until you're home with those people you have advanced, with your family, in the presence of God. I hope all of this has helped you to make a case. Now listen, I'm going to really quickly, I've got a few seconds here. I always want to say, if you are subscribed to our daily email at coldcasechristianity.com, if you aren't, go there now and subscribe, because I am going to start accepting questions, which I'm going to start answering here on the show. And the only way to ask your question is to hit reply from the daily email and send the question to me that way. If you already get my daily email, please start sending me questions and we will address those here. And I'll hope to see you next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, and Alive.